Good morning, Python programmers. This morning I'm going to go through the first few sections of Chapter 1 again, telling you exactly what I'm expecting you to glean from those chapters, and then I want to continue on and finish out Chapter 1 with this lesson. I've got a presentation view in my teacher version, so I'm able to show you things pretty quickly here. So note that in 1.1, the general programming, there's some vocabulary that you should be familiar with. Words like program, input, process, output, variables, these things are going to be in any programming language that you see. Computational thinking is pretty much being expected of just about everyone in the workforce now. So this course gives you a little bit more of a heads up on what to expect in that area. An algorithm is a sequence of instructions that solves a problem. It's called an algorithm. So basically, I have a sequence of instructions that I use in order to drive my car. So you could say that that was an algorithm. It does solve a problem. It gets me to the store. But we could do things like ask for a radius and input the radius from a user, and then have that calculated into volumes and areas for spheres and circles. That would certainly be a sequence of instructions that solves a problem, therefore algorithm. For the first few weeks, we're going to use the Python interpreter that's embedded into zyBooks. So our interpreter is already in here. In a few weeks, we're going to be using the IDE called idle, and it's a fairly simple one. And then a few weeks after that, we'll download JetBrains and begin working with that. I'll remind you again that you should be taking notes as you go through these videos, because you will be studying towards test and final exams. And you may not have enough time at the time of a test to go back through all the videos. Python is functional programming, so it actually does one line of code at a time. So you could go to the idle IDE, which will have prompts like this. You could type your program one line at a time, and it's not saved to a file or anywhere or anything. On the zyBooks ones that we're working here, for the most part, you're saving things to a file within the little window, and then you're hitting a run button to actually run it. But for some of these participation activities, you're doing one line at a time, functional programming, just like this. These are fairly important vocabulary words. Statement is a program instruction. Expressions are code that return a value when evaluated. For example, this wage times hours times weeks is an expression. So notice it doesn't have something equals. That would be an assignment. So when you have a variable and you put equals and put an expression on the other side, then you have an assignment. An expression could just be putting in a number, 15 or something, or a name, Susan Lauer. The print function is actually a method, so you're going to need parentheses around your print function. So make sure when you say print that you actually put parentheses. The comments in Python always start with a hashtag, which is kind of cool because there are a lot of things that start with hashtags that are commentaries. So anywhere you want to put a line to describe what your code is doing that you don't want to have as part of your algorithm, it's just a descriptor, then you'll put in a hashtag and write exactly what the code is doing. We'll play with this a little bit more today. In the Python 500 race we looked at yesterday, there was an awful lot of code in here. Please don't concern yourself with the code that they give you to run some of these programs. They want you to have an experience, this zyBooks team, that allows you, and I want you to also, that allows you to see some programming that's a lot more complicated than you're ready for yet, but you get an idea of where you're heading for. So here we change some variables. I'm going to change this one so that they're exactly the same and they tie, because I'm interested in seeing what it says. So I changed the variables. That's all they were wanting me to do. And I should see that it's a tie. All right, so when you're looking at these, you can look down through. I recommend highly that you do, especially if you've worked with some programming before, because you'll start to get an insight as to what you're going to expect to see as we get further through the course. So looking at the 1.3 lab, the warm-up on Hello World, we did this yesterday. And these labs, they're going to give you steps to go through and tell you how many points you're going to get for each. I want to show you that if you just do the whole thing at one time, I'll go back through and do it real quickly. Noting that there was two-character sequence that we had to put in here, an escape character, because a quote is something different in Python. So you have to be very careful when you're working with things like quotes and backslashes. You have to do an escape character, the backslash, before you do that. So here, if I put this in, and then put my print statements in, if I go to submit mode and submit this, I want to see what the grading looks like. So I submit for grading, and it shows me that this worked, and this worked. And it gave me the full score here. So I could have done this whole thing. So we play around with it a little bit. You can do the entire lab at one time if you're understanding what to do, and submit it just one time. That does save you a few minutes, precious moments of your life, so to speak, going through these labs. I wanted to remind you too that you can do a new line with a /n, a \n. Remember the backslash is above the enter key on your keyboard. If you have a non-American keyboard, you might have a little bit more trouble finding that backslash, but it's there. So the escape character is backslash, and if you put backslash, it actually will print a backslash, and that's the only way you can get that done in Python. I'm a little ways down in 1.5 here, looking at the new line character. So note here that if I wanted to print 1, 2, 3, one line after the other, I just put a new line in. I didn't put any spaces. It looks really weird. Just get used to it as you go through programming, and it'll be just fine. I could also put a blank print statement in here, an empty print statement, and that'll give me a completely blank line here. Print goes to the next line. So this goes to the next line, and then this statement goes to the next line, then it prints it, and then it goes to the next line. So right here, it should actually have another box in here. I'm adding another blank line in here because this print statement does take you to the next line. White space is very important in Python. If you put white spaces in the wrong places, you're going to be a little bit frustrated with your efforts. So make sure you're careful about white spaces. We changed this string yesterday, and it was important to understand you have variables, the country population and the country name. Those are variables. They are initialized, so they have an expression that they have assigned to them. This is an assignment. To do this, I would change the string so that it says exactly what's here. And yesterday, when I did this, I went up here and said the population of, and did it a little less carefully. So I'm going to do this one thing at a time this time. The population of. I don't want a space in here because when I put this comma after it, it actually puts a space in. You see the space that showed up here? And then China is the country, actually the country name. Pick the wrong variable here. Control-C, country name. You see one thing at a time, it's going across the list, across the line here. And then I'll put comma because I'm going to put another expression in. This is an expression. They want the quotes in, but this is supposed to be was. No space because it automatically put a space. So when I put that comma in, it put a space. So you want to pay attention to the white spaces. That's what this is doing. The comma is adding a white space. So in the next one, I'm going to put was, and I want the country population. Control-C. On the keyboard, if I highlight Control-C, hold down Control-C, and then Control-V for paste. And then the last thing I want to put in is in 2011. Now I can put single quotes or double quotes, but I have to be consistent. So in 2011, if I put double quotes in and close it with a single, it's not going to like that. But if I close it with a double, it should like that. And then I also need to close out my parentheses. Now it's giving me an error here because it already has the parentheses closed out. I also need to put a period in there, so I went and put that in. So that is the code as it should have been. All I've done is put an expression in this print statement. This whole thing is one expression. It's a string of them with commas separating them, putting in white space where it was necessary. You're going to want to be very careful that you enter or return. You press the enter key, return on your keyboard to go to a new line when they've asked you to do that. So here, remember that print outputs a new line, so they want you to actually type what it should output. So we're going to hit start, type the program's output. This should be "and it is nice, period." And then I'll check it, and it says that's wonderful. It says type the output, so I should have Joe on one line, is on another line, and nice, period. If I check this, I wanted to show you this, the output's incorrect because I didn't hit enter again. So the output, what they're asking me to do is type the program's output, so I need to check this. If I hit next, it'll take me back. So I hit enter, I can check it again. You can take these over and over again. You could actually figure out what it's supposed to be from somebody else's and put it in. But the point is to understand exactly how to do these problems when you're working throughout the rest of the labs and exercises. If I go next, it's going to have me do the person's age is 19. Notice here there's no white space given, but the comma makes a white space. This is all in one line, so I just type "and is" with a colon 19. No period or anything. And it's going to go to the next line. If I forget, it'll be annoying for just a second. If I check it, it says that's correct. So we can do an input here by putting the words input with parentheses. It's a method, so it has to have the parentheses here. Like print is a method and it has a parentheses. You can put stuff in here. We'll see that happen here in a few minutes. So in the screen, it's going to print enter the name of your best friend. And it's going to stay on the same line because this end equals with this, and it's going to put a space after it. Stay on the same line, and this is a prompt, and you'll say what your best friend's name is. The input with nothing in it, nothing telling you what type it is automatically a string. And then you can print that out just like this. The type can be changed. So if you want to use a number, it has to be changed to a number. This int here changes the string 123 to a number. If I want to input an integer, I want to put int in front of input. When you type the number, in this case 8 was typed. If I type the number 8, it comes in as a string, is immediately changed to an integer because it says to. If you want something that has decimals in it, you would use the word float. Now this is not difficult, but you do want to study this code and make sure you have it very well studied up so that when I ask you to do this on the test, and that was a win, I asked you to do this on the test, you'll be able to do it very easily. So Python is not a heavily typed language like Java is very heavily typed, or Fortran. These are very heavily typed language, which means that everything has to be declared as a variable. This wage is not declared as an integer, but what's being stored in it is an integer. So I didn't have to say integer wage, which is what you'd have to do in other programming languages. The challenge activity 1.5.4 says to read 3 integers from user input without a prompt. So I'm just going to type what that says. I'm not going to read the rest of it because basically it's like reading a recipe. So I'm getting out the flour, and I'll need to assign them to a variable. So I might just put int1. You can call them anything you want to, as long as you're using letters, numbers, underscore. int1 equals, I want user input and I want it to be an integer. So I'm doing input. And basically I can copy that and paste it. So I'm doing that 2 more times. Control V, paste, and I'll go in here and switch this up. Now if it's going to help you to retype it every time, because that is one more way to study, then by all means continue to retype it every time. I'll remind you to pause the video so that you can continue programming and practicing what you should be practicing here before I tell you what this is going to be. I'm not going to do a lot of these exercises for you, but since you haven't done these before, I think it's a good thing for me to go through these exercises. So it says I want to print the product of those integers, and I could make another variable to print the product, or I could just print multiplying them in the print statement. It also says that there will be a test here of several different ones. So our system's going to run your program. See the test passed over here? All tests have passed. I've actually done this one before, so it says I've done it before. But here, what that means is that they've written a test, and when you put in your input, it's going to check those against what it should have the output as. There's a huge branch of testing in programming, and people are hired to be testers in programming, which means it's that you actually, if you worked as a tester, you would actually write code that asserted that some things were going to be true when you put in like 2, 3, 5, and that the output should be 30. So this is basically telling you the pseudocode for what the test would look like if you could see what the test code looked like here. So here the print statement should be print. I want to multiply int1 times int2 times int3. I caution you that this will not work, this multiplication, if you didn't put int in here. If you don't type your variable when you're putting it in, and that means give it a type, an integer type, then the multiplication will not work. If I run this, it shows me that all the tests were passed and I've got the correct code in here. Now we've done some zyLabs already, but now we're looking at 1.6, the training basics, and it tells you exactly what's going on when you're working through zyLab. I thought it would pique your interest to do a couple before you actually read through this, because now you're going, okay, what's really going on here? So they're describing the developer and submit mode for you. So you want to read through this and carefully go through the lab. I'm looking at the lab activity 1.6.1, and it's a little different than the one we just looked at because it has input that you're going to have to put in for the program. So sometimes it'll have tests and it'll show the tests passed on the side when you get done. Sometimes it will have you put input in, so you need to be aware of which ones are which. Some of the instructions will be fixing bugs, so it tells you that you're going to multiply two numbers, find a square, so there's definitely a bug here. Notice the end output here. This is not going to go to a next line. So make sure that you read through the instructions carefully. It could be that you're supposed to fix an awful lot in here and that you're supposed to put in more code. I'm not going to complete this exercise. By the way, I will ask for fixing bugs on your programming when you're doing it for the test. So you should be able to fix bugs pretty easily. The 1.7.1 lab is actually considerably easier than the ones we've previously done, and occasionally I'll put these out of order like this on purpose so that you're not overthinking things when you're asked. This says simply write a program that outputs hello world. It's just that simple. Notice the double quotes here. It may mean that it wants you to output hello world without them like this. The double quotes actually in here is telling you that it wants a string outputted as without the double quotes. So play with that. You've got the developer and the submit mode that you should be playing with in both of these. In 1.8, they want you to have the user enter an X and then write another line of code. So when you're writing the code, these are the things that will need to be done. And the 5 is something that will show up because you've asked for the program to put input in. So that's what this lab is about. So you want to have them enter the X, and then you're going to get an input from the user. This doesn't have to necessarily be an integer coming in because it doesn't tell the user to put an integer in, but it's implied when we're working with it. We're not being quite as careful yet because we're not at that level of programming. But here, it does change it to an integer. If I print the X, that gives me this first little block like this, and this is not what's expected. The user would be putting the 5 as an input. So this is actually what should be printed. This is what the program should be asking for. So here you can see you're going to mistakenly echo this, so you just need to take out that line of code and you're pretty much done with the program. 1.9 lab is very simple, so don't overthink it. You could basically just copy and paste, put it down here, and put in your prints. 110 really only requires one line of code put in. It says type your code here. Make sure you're always putting that after that code, after that line. This code does require input, so remember that you will need to put your program input into the box down here. Section 1.11 actually goes through the different kinds of errors. So you want to make sure that you understand the different kinds of errors that are in there. A syntax error violates the programming languages rule. That would be like leaving out a quote when you needed a quote. On this one, when I run the code, it would give me that I have a syntax error, and it shows me where the syntax error is, but I can't put two print statements on the same line here. I also meant to tell you earlier, but now is good enough. Everything you write in Python has to begin at the left margin. So everything there. Indentation means something completely different. So when we get to the place where we have methods that we're doing and if statements and loops, then we'll have to use indent in order to do those correctly. I've kind of mentioned a runtime error earlier. If I try to multiply things that are strings, it's going to give me a runtime error. The code looks fine, but it'll crash when you actually do it. An unintended termination of the program is called a crash, and I just said it. Basically, a runtime error is just going to give you an error box. But when your program crashes, it's usually because there's some kind of value that's been input that can't be used there, and you'll get an error message kind of like this. It's a kind of a good skill to have to be able to read these error messages. So I can see that the first line, the salary is $40,000, printed exactly like it was supposed to. Enter integer Henry, and when you put in Henry, because it says enter integer, and then it's an integer input. So if I'd left int off, it would let me put Henry in and it would be fine. But that's not what I wanted here. So when I put the word Henry in instead of an integer, then it gives me this traceback thing, invalid literal for int with base 10. So it's kind of, it explains it pretty well, but sometimes it doesn't. It can be kind of difficult to do it. So there's a little table here that explains the different kinds of errors. There are places, if you wanted to apply for a programming job, that they'll expect you to understand these different kinds of errors, but I don't really expect you to remember which kind of error you're working with, just that you have errors and where you can find them. Of course, one level up is that you do remember the different kinds of errors. Logic errors is the program is logically flawed somehow or another, so when you run the thing, everything works beautifully, but there's no way you should have gotten what you got. And a bug, we've seen some bugs. If I leave off the quote at the end of a print, that would be a bug in the program. 1.11.1 is asking you just to fix the bug, so read it carefully and see what you're supposed to do. There's a bug in here somewhere. When you run it, it's going to run just fine, but it's not going to give you what you expected. 1.11.4 describes why we use the word bug the way that we do in programming. So read through that. It's kind of entertaining. There's a Wikipedia link there if you're interested. 1.12 shows you what the IDE, the idle IDE, looks like. It's a development environment. We'll be playing with this after the first test, so you can read through this and kind of get an idea about it, but we aren't going to use it until a little bit later in the semester. 1.13 talks about computers and programs in general, and you should read through it because you should know this material, but I will not test you on it. So make sure you read through and work through the exercises. The same goes for section 1.14 and 1.15. I find the language history here to be somewhat interesting. There's lots of different things you can look on the web for if you're interested in knowing more about the language history for Python. 1.16 is a little more in-depth about why white space matters, so we're looking at blank spaces and new lines. So you want to read through this carefully and work through the exercises. 1.17 is just having you correct the one statement that's incorrect here. 1.18 lab. 1.18 lab is basic output with variables, so it's going to tell you what you should be doing. It actually lists the description here, and then it shows you kind of what it should look like. So as we go down through here, remember the developer and the submit modes are here, and if your code is going to require input, and it does, so see what your input should be here. Being careful that you put new lines in everywhere you're supposed to put a new line in. 1.19 is just output art. So there's an exercise on doing a Christmas tree. There's also one with the little cat face here. If you look at the beginning of 1.19, it gives you a place that a link that you can touch, and there's an instructor's notes that sometimes I'll put in here. So look for these. They don't stand out really brightly, but there's an instructor's note there. If I touch this link, it takes me to a place where I can look at some art like this, and it's called ASCII, A-S-C-I-I, ASCII art. This was really popular when I was a little girl, for people to find pictures like this and actually type them on their typewriters. So this is a little more advanced than just typing on a typewriter if we're trying to program it up. But you can look through here and play with pictures if you wanted to. For instance, if you were interested in maybe dogs, you can go to the dog, which is right here. And if I touch this link, I see dogs. And maybe I want to look at this one. I kind of like this one. Notice that some of these are going to have escape characters on them. So when I copy this, then I go back over here and paste it in. So now I have my picture of my dog, but I'll have to, if I run it, I'm going to have nothing but a mess. So indentation and all kinds of problems. Alright, so first of all I need to print in front of each of these, and a single quote or a double quote, whichever one you want to use. Control C in front of each of them, and I want to start at the very beginning of the line and paste this in. I'm doing Control C and then Control V, hold down, or Command if you're using a Mac. Makes it a little easier. Make sure you're at the beginning of the line. Put the print in to begin with. Now there are lots of escape characters that are going to be needed here, but if I go to the end of each of these lines, I can just put in the end quote in the parentheses, end quote, parentheses, end quote, parentheses, end quote, parentheses, end quote, in parentheses, just like that. If I run it now, it's going to give me a compilation error. It's going to tell me where it was. So the print on this line here, that's the first one I got a problem at, and it says this is the problem, but that's not actually the problem. The problem happens because I have some backslashes that need to be taken care of and some quotes that need to be taken care of. So the backslash here needs to have a backslash in front of it, and the quote needs to have a backslash in front of it, because that's my escape character. If I run it now, it should get past that line unless I missed something. So it got past that line, and it gets past line 3 and line 4. I'm not sure about the quotes in here, so we may have to come back and do something with quotes here. But it says line 6, and I don't have a line 6, so this is the last line. Oh, I guess I do. No, that's line 5. But it says line 6, probably because it's interpreting something else up here kind of strangely. But you can play with this until you actually get the thing to print. But notice here it says that it doesn't like this last parentheses because the parentheses in the wrong place because there's too many quotes. But everywhere I see a quote, I'm going to have to put in a backslash quote, except for when I'm doing the print. Now I could have gone to Notepad here. I'm going to go back and grab my ASCII, Control C. Just open up Notepad, Control V. And before I put this into programming, I can do an edit and a find. Well, actually, yeah, find, then I'll replace. I'm going to do a replace with, everywhere I have a backslash, I'm going to put a backslash. So that replaces all the single backslashes with 2 of them, the escape character and the backslash. So replace all. And you can see it replaced them. If you hit it twice, it's going to replace them again, and that's just annoying. So make sure you don't hit it twice. Although if I do that, if I do a Control Z, that should undo what I just did. So if I accidentally hit it twice, I could do a Control Z. I also want to put in, anywhere I have a quote, I'm going to put a backslash quote. So if I have a quote, a single quote, I'm going to put a backslash with a single quote, the escape character, and the single quote, and replace all those. So you can see all the ones that got replaced. And this is a double quote, a backslash with a double quote. This is what I'm going to replace it with, and replace all those. And I think that's all I need to replace here. So I'm going to close out of that. Now I can copy this, Control C, and maybe put my print statements, put it in I guess I'll have to redo my print statements. That's not too bad though. So I'll put it in here, Control V, and I'll put my prints back in. So I put the prints back in and the end prints, and then I ran it, and I end up with my little dog picture like this. So this is one more place to practice and understand. Remember that you can always go to a notepad, type everything in, or copy and paste it in. In this case, I copied and pasted. And then you can make some editing and paste it in here and do part of your programming. The 1.2 lab is a Mad Lib, and I don't know if you've played with these before. Basically, it asks for some input and you put it in blanks, and then you end up with some crazy sentence when you get done, or a crazy story. So you'll type the code there. You have some input that you're going to have to put in, so remember, it's not optional in this one because it's actually asking for it. And then you want to print. So the print line's already in there for you. You want to put your code in here at number 2. So you'll start typing in here at number 2 and have the input for the 4 things that you want: the first name, generic, whole number, and plural noun. That concludes my lecture on chapter 1. So you have 2 different videos that are combined to make chapter 1. I'll do similar things for the rest of the chapter. You'll have a couple of videos to look at, kind of a look-see, and then let's work through some of the problems. You'll want to make sure that you look through both the lectures. I'll go very briefly through anything that anybody has questions on in class, and I'll talk briefly about chapter 2 in class.